Hello there! Welcome to Scan Key Productions. I'm Conor Grace Cocon. Let's get into the video. Today's video we're going to be asking the question of what if Bush overthrew Saddam? Now that's not the Bush that you're thinking of. You're not thinking of Bush Jr. And when we talk about overthrowing Saddam, we're not talking about the Iraq War that we all know about. We're talking about the Gulf War, in which George Bush Sr., so George Bush Jr.'s father, was the president, and this was in response to Saddam Hussein invading Kuwait and the effort to kick him out of that country. So just for a little bit of context, what happened is that Saddam Hussein in 1990 invaded Kuwait. And this was because, he saw Kuwait as the 19th province of Iraq, because like the British, when they carved up the territory, they took away most of Iraq's coastline and gave it to Kuwait. And so Saddam Hussein, who had just come out of the Iraq-Iran war, which had been a 8-year-long war, which cost many lives and yet didn't really have much territorial gain, Iraq was bankrupt as a result of this. And so what he wanted to do was basically invade the tiny oil-rich country of Kuwait, and then that way he would have even more oil. So when he invaded Kuwait, there wasn't very much resistance, and he was able to knock it out very quickly. But further to the south, you had the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and the oil fields there were just a few hundred miles away. And the problem with all this was that the Saudi army was very weak, and it wouldn't have taken much for Saddam's army, which at the time was, I believe, either the fourth or the fifth largest army in the world, for him to have marched on straight there and taken the Saudi oil fields. And this panicked both the Saudi government and also the US government, because within the Middle East, America wanted to maintain a balance of power, and for a dictator like Saddam Hussein to, basically be able to sweep in and take all that oil, yes, it was something which the Americans couldn't stand, and it's something which obviously the Saudis couldn't stand either. And so the US under George Bush offered to put troops in Saudi Arabia in order to defend Saudi Arabia, and also in the event of him not retreating from Kuwait, for him then to go and liberate Kuwait from Iraqi forces. Now this troop deployment had ramifications, which we'll get onto a little bit later, but for now all you need to know is that there was a coalition of many different countries around the world, and they, under the banner of the UN, were intent on pushing Saddam's forces out of Kuwait. Saddam Hussein refused, and so this inevitably led to what happened the next year, which was Operation Desert Storm. So this was the incredibly successful campaign led by the American General Schwarzkopf. It basically was like a World War II kind of pincer maneuver, where basically the Saudis thought that the attack was going to come through Kuwait, but they left their flanks completely open, and so as a result the British and the Americans swung round and basically encircled the entire Iraqi army. And as the Iraqi army was retreating out Kuwait, there was an aerial bombing campaign along the famous Highway 80, and Saddam's forces were completely wiped out. And obviously it did kill many civilians, but for the most part it killed his retreating troops. Now on a strategic level, what would have happened in most wars would have been that they would have carried on pushing all the way to Baghdad, overthrown Saddam, and then that would have been that. But this didn't end up happening. The reason for this is that the UN only gave support for the Americans and their allies to basically kick them out of Kuwait, but not to push forward. The UN wasn't in favour of regime change. And so as a result, George Bush Sr. just kind of left it at that. And so this timeline imagines what would have happened if he had just been like his son and ignored what the UN said and pushed on anyway. So this is what we're going to look into in this video. Now in our own timeline, what ended up happening after the liberation of Kuwait was that Iraq ended up having many sanctions put upon it. So its oil was not able to be sold in the open market, and many of its other exports weren't either, right? And as a result, the Iraqi economy contracted. And this was done in an effort to limit the Iraqi capacity to launch another war like this, and also to put sanctions on the Saddam regime as a punishment for how they had acted. Now, people criticised this sanction regime because they, at the time it was reported that up to 500,000 Iraqi children had died from it. However, since the subsequent invasion of Iraq in 2003, most of the studies that have looked into it have found that actually a lot of this was to do with Saddam Hussein's propaganda, and basically they played up and over-exaggerated the numbers. And when experts went there, they found that actually the child mortality rate didn't decline by a significant amount. It had been 40 out of 1,000 beforehand, and it kind of stayed at around that level. So if 500,000 Iraqi children died out of a population of 23 million, it's kind of it would have like popped up like quite easily. But you know, as it is, it's kind of inconclusive as to exactly how many people died. However, after the war, what ended up happening was that a number of Shias end up rising up as well as the Kurds. So, for those who don't know, Iraq is made up of three separate groups. So you have the Sunni Arabs, you have the Shia Arabs, who make up the majority, and you have the Kurds in the north, yeah, who want to have their own state. And so Saddam Hussein was a Sunni Arab, and yet he suppressed the majority Shias, and he also suppressed the Kurds, notably when he gassed the Kurds in 1988. And so to stop this, the Americans and the British implemented a no-fly zone over Iraq. So basically what they did is they flew thousands and thousands of sorties over southern Iraq and northern Iraq to ensure that Saddam's forces couldn't just carpet bomb these people and gas them as they had done in 1988. But beside this, they did nothing else. They didn't support the uprisings. They didn't offer them any aid. They didn't offer them any help at all. And so as a result, Saddam's land forces were able to go in and crush these uprisings. And so the next 12 years end up just being a situation where Iraq was very poor, still very divided, and you still had this terrible dictator running the country. But what would have happened if he had just been overthrown then? Well, something to note is that obviously when Iraq was invaded in 2003, the following year what ended up happening is that a whole bunch of Islamist extremist groups ended up, flooding into the country, right? So Al-Qaeda hadn't really been much of a presence beforehand because Saddam Hussein was a secularist, who's an Arab socialist or a Ba'athist, and so he really he cracked down on Islamists in his own country. So the claim by George Bush Jr. that he was in cahoots with Al-Qaeda, who were responsible for 9/11, there wasn't really much evidence for this because, the last people that Saddam Hussein would have allied with would have been Al-Qaeda and the like. But in the absence of his iron rule, what ended up happening is that all these foreign fighters end up flooding into the country. And on top of that, the Iranian regime, which was hostile to America as well, as part of the so-called Axis of Evil, what ended up happening is that they ended up sending in supplies and money into Iraq as well to destabilize it. And so as a result, what had been a very successful invasion in 2003 ended up, very quickly becoming a quagmire and ended up becoming almost like another Vietnam, in which many Americans end up dying, many civilians end up being killed, both from coalition forces and from Al-Qaeda and the like. And so, it ended up just being a huge mess. And on top of that, weapons of mass destruction, which Bush and Blair had said were definitely in Iraq, they never materialized. They were either destroyed beforehand or they were sent somewhere else. And so in turn, public opinion turned against it. It was already from the offset one of the most unpopular wars of all time. Actually, the largest demonstration that ever took place in Britain took place in 2003, in which me, as a little 9-year-old, was also part of, right? And this was a Stop the War campaign, and this was to try and obviously stop the war from actually starting. But regardless, Bush and Blair went ahead with it anyway. So, how would an invasion of Iraq happening in 1991 have been different from an invasion of Iraq in 2003? It would have been different for several reasons because, while Al-Qaeda was quite a prominent force, it was nowhere near as much of a force as it would later be by kind of the early 2000s. And so, all these Islamists kind of flooding in and stuff, it would have been more difficult for them. Not impossible, but more difficult. So, the actual invasion itself it's not like it would have gone off without a hitch, but it wouldn't have been as deadly, it wouldn't have been as costly as it ended up being. And so a quicker war, a decisive war, would have taken Saddam Hussein out in 1991, would have, in many ways been an easier war for the Americans. But at the same time, the Gulf War ended up being a catalyst for the later war on terror. And the reason for that is that one of bin Laden's main reasons for doing 9/11 was because American troops, like I said before, were stationed in Saudi Arabia, the land of the two holy cities, Mecca and Medina, which is sacred ground for Muslims. And because of this, bin Laden said, it's sacrilegious, for infidels, non-believers, to be in the land of the Prophet, for them to be in the Holy Land. Now, the Saudi royal family, they pretend like they're religious extremists. At the same time, they're just interested in power, and so they'll pretend to their population that they're devout and stuff, but at the same time in the West they'll go gambling, they'll have prostitutes, they'll do this, do drugs, etc. So they're not really, they're not on the same page as Bin Laden is, yeah, even though they helped spread the same kind of Wahhabi ideology. So because they're only interested in power, what they basically was like, whoa, hold on. This dude is trying to invade us. He's trying to take over our kingdom, yeah? And you're complaining that America has volunteered to put some troops in the thing. Yeah, get out. And so as a result, Bin Laden was banished, yeah, from Saudi Arabia from that point on. But this banishment only furthered his hatred towards the Saudis and towards the Americans. And so it was from that day forward that he devoted his energies into attacking America. So you had the World Trade Center bombings in 1993, where Al Qaeda tried to blow up the Twin Towers but failed. Then in 1998, you had the bombing of American troops in East Africa. And yeah, so many people died from that as well. And then a few years later, in 2001, you had 9/11, in which 4 planes flew into America. One of the planes was shot down, one of them went into the side of the Pentagon, and 2 of them went into the Twin Towers and took those buildings down. Now, I know this video is going to have a lot of conspiracy theorists talking about, oh, they never did it and da da da. And while there's a precedent for false flag attacks, such as the sinking of the USS Maine in 1898 in order to get America into the Spanish-American War, yeah, it seems like there's a clear pattern, yeah. Like, if you're doing all these terrorist attacks against America, and then you do that, I mean, if you already tried to blow up the World Trade Center and then 8 years later actually flew planes into it, it doesn't seem that surprising that this group was responsible, especially when they admitted that they were responsible for it. Now, something to note is that obviously the 1990s would have been completely different if this had gone this way. So, the 1990s, we kind of look back on it and a period of peace and kind of general prosperity and stuff. But if there had been this quagmire of a war taking place in that time, it would have really, really fundamentally changed things. In particular, the 1992 election, which we discussed in our previous video of what if Ross Perot won. Now, if the war continued, and if it had been a quagmire, and if it had been really costly and hadn't had the support of the international community, what would have then happened is that Bush most certainly would have lost that election. Because even though he had just come off of a victory with the Gulf War, and this was a resoundingly popular war because it was quick and it was decisive and America was victorious, and it undid a lot of the kind of Vietnam syndrome, which people speak about, in which America felt really bad about after it lost Vietnam. So even with this kind of rally behind the flag kind of thing, yeah, he still ended up losing. But the thing is that the different candidates' positions in that election would have been what was really pivotal. So Clinton, within our own timeline, was in favour of keeping the no-fly zone. So throughout his whole presidency, the no-fly zone continued. Actually, the no-fly zone continued all the way from 1991 all the way till 2003. And then also in 1998, there was a 4-day consecutive bombing campaign in which Clinton bombed military installations in Iraq. So if there had been a war that had dragged on, I don't see him getting America out of it. Maybe there would have been less troops put into it. Maybe we would have kind of done like an Obama, kept the war going for a bit, but then kind of slowly withdrew. But yeah, I don't really see him being the peace candidate. However, Ross Perot, within our own timeline, even with Gulf War One, he was opposed to American involvement there. So if he didn't even support this war when this was just, attacking an aggressor who invaded a peaceful country, etc., etc., if he didn't even support it then, he definitely wouldn't have supported this long protracted war. And so he would have been the peace candidate. And so while he had a poor showing in the 1992 election, I think that he would have got even more votes. Maybe even he could have won, as we discussed in that video, if he had ran on that ticket of vote for me and I will end the war. So in some ways, this version of the Gulf War, it would have been more decisive, it would have probably been less costly, but at the same time, it would have had the same effect in that Bush would have lost the election and that the war would have basically ended relatively soon because people just didn't have the stomach for that sort of long protracted quagmire, because the previous war had been the Vietnam War and this was still fresh in the minds of many Americans in a way that it wasn't in 2003. So with that being said, definitely hit the like button, share with your friends. It's really important to share with your friends so that way more people can see it. Also as well, subscribe and watch a whole lot more of our videos. Watch the ones that we've mentioned in this video, and also stay tuned for our next video, which is going to be on what if America didn't have the right to bear arms, right? So this is to do with the Second Amendment. This is imagining what would have happened if the Founding Fathers didn't put that in the Bill of Rights. And yeah, it's completely different America, but it's just something to kind of think about. So with that being said, have a great day and bye.